All right, so in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to analyze your own single system design data. And what I've done is I've created a CSV file that you can enter your own data into. I just named it SSD analysis.csv. So this is more or less the format that your data is going to look like. The day that you collected it, you might have to add some more rows in here. I think it's a good idea to keep one row blank where I just put NA. Just to easily be able to visually see the difference between your baseline and intervention. So, and this is just an example of 2 weeks worth of data, 7 days of baseline, 7 days of intervention, and I just picked 5. Most people are going to be doing these single system designs within minute increments. So I've just done 5, 10, 15, up to 35 through the baseline and the intervention. This is where you're going to be putting in your own data. So you're going to have to modify these within Excel. The phase is just A for baseline, B for intervention. So I would just leave this alone. But you can modify this accordingly depending on what kind of data you've got. So you might need to add a few more days in. But I would generally leave kind of like most other things alone, like days, minutes, and phase. That should all be the same for your paper. You might just have to modify the values for the minutes or add or subtract a couple days, but that won't really affect your code all that much. The next step, I've done all these 3. It's the same as all the other activities. So I've found the data and attached it already. So the first step here is just to assess your data for autocorrelation. So it's the same as the first activity we've done where we looked at autocorrelation. So I'm just going to put this in here just to test for to see if we've got any issues here. I'm just going to run that. So if you have a statistically significant test of autocorrelation, then you're going to have to do a moving average. So you can just follow these steps here, and if you do need to smooth it out, you can use the moving average and then save it. It's the same as we did in the autocorrelation activity. So you would just do the AB moving average and then save your results. So then you would just save it like we did with the moving average for Jenny. But in this example, it's perfectly flat, so we wouldn't really be too worried about having to do a moving average here. Okay, so the next step is just to create a simple A-B plot. So I'm just going to copy and paste this in here. And then after we run it, we'll get just the incrementals of 5 going up for the baseline and 5 going up for intervention. Yours is going to look different based on what your outcome data is. So we can go ahead and label this the same as we did before. We can do A-B lines for minutes to separate baseline from intervention. Okay, so I'll just copy this out and put it in here. This will help us to distinguish between the baseline and intervention. So we'll just click right in the middle. And you can hit yes to accept. It's not a big deal if it's not 100% perfect. It looks good enough for me. You can put in more labels if you want. There's examples from the previous activities where you can see what we did, and you can feel free to add or not add depending on what you want it to look like. All right, so the next step is to illustrate central tendency. So if there's no outliers, and in the example that I have there aren't, you can just use the mean. So I'll just put in the mean for the baseline and for the intervention phase here. If you did have outliers, then you'd want to use the median. So I'm just going to throw up the mean for the baseline and the intervention really quick. So just copy these out one at a time. So the mean for the baseline is 20, so you can click here and hit yes. And the mean for the intervention phase, I'm going to click in here and copy paste that. It is also 20, obviously, because we use the exact same data for the baseline and the intervention. Yours would look different for sure. So hypothetically, if you found a trend that you wanted to illustrate, the first thing I would recommend doing is, just so you don't lose this, especially after if you've labeled it, is to export this graph first, because if you put in the regression lines, then it's going to wipe this out. So if there was a regression line or a trend that you'd want to emphasize, you could copy this code out to do the acceleration line, but you certainly don't need to. So this is acceleration for the baseline and the intervention. Again, you don't necessarily need this, but sometimes it's interesting to look at. So you can add these graphs in if you wanted to. You won't necessarily gain or lose points by doing this, but just for your own interest. And then the last step is to do what we did in Activity 5, which is to do the t-test. So we can test from baseline to intervention to see if there's a statistically significant change. So we can run the t-test here again by pasting this code, and we can look at the simple two-sample t-test here, and here's our p-value in degrees of freedom. So if it's below 0.05, then we can know that it's statistically significant. In this case, even with this silly example, the p-value is 1, so it's not a statistically significant change. It's the exact same from baseline to intervention, so there's no change at all, actually. But in a different example, hypothetically, if it were statistically significant, we can look at the effect size by pasting this in here. And we can see from our silly example that there's 0% change. So our D index is 0 with 0% change. So that's just from the silly example, but your data will look different. I even have an example of APA write-up here of how to write up a t-test in APA format. So you can use this, and more or less you can just copy and paste your own operationally defined problem in here. Most people use the average number of minutes spent exercising per day. So whatever blanking per day you want to fill in here. Then you can put the results of your t-test with your mean baseline, mean intervention, and range as well, and whether it is or isn't statistically significant, and if it is, what the effect size is there. So yeah, if you want to review the text, there's some great examples in there as well. Otherwise, I'll look forward to seeing the results in your write-up in the results section of your final paper. And as always, just email me with any specific questions that you may have.